The house was unusually quiet that evening, almost too quiet, and Mara felt it pressing against her chest as she leaned against the kitchen window, watching rain streak down the glass in uneven patterns, each drop catching the dim glow of the streetlights outside, reflecting a world she felt both part of and apart from. Since her husband's passing 2 years ago, silence had become an unwelcome companion, amplifying every small creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from the street, making her feel both isolated and exposed. And now, with her stepson Ethan back home after finishing college, the emptiness felt different, less hollow, yet more confusing, because his presence brought warmth and tension at the same time. A reminder of life moving forward and of changes she hadn't anticipated. And as she watched him come through the front door later than usual, the soft clatter of his shoes on the hardwood, the way he paused in the hallway, Mara sensed a heaviness in his movements, a seriousness in his eyes that made her heart thump in a way that was part worry and part curiosity. Because Ethan had always been polite, almost reserved, keeping a certain distance that Mara respected but often wondered about, and tonight, that distance felt like it was going to break, like something important was about to happen, something that could shift the balance of their lives. And as he stepped closer, brushing wet hair from his forehead, his voice broke slightly when he asked her to sit with him, his hands fidgeting in a nervous rhythm, revealing an emotion Mara rarely saw, a vulnerability that stirred a protective, almost maternal instinct inside her. And as they both sank onto the worn couch in the living room, the soft lamplight casting gentle shadows on the walls, Mara noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided her eyes at first, the subtle tremor in his voice as he began to speak, confessing thoughts he had buried deep, regrets he had carried alone, moments of loneliness and guilt that Mara had never imagined, moments that made her realize she had misread his silence as indifference when it had been a struggle of its own kind. And with every word he shared, every hesitation, every glance that flickered toward her seeking understanding, Mara felt a swell of emotion, a mixture of relief, empathy, and a quiet shock that the boy who had grown into this young man was now revealing the depth of his heart. And though the storm outside continued to drum against the windows, inside, the air seemed heavier with unsaid things, electric with the promise of change, and Mara, heart racing, couldn't help but feel that this night, ordinary as it might seem from the outside, was about to set the stage for something neither of them could have predicted, something that would alter the rhythm of their lives and draw them closer in ways that were tender, complex, and profoundly human. And as Ethan finally looked up, meeting her gaze with an honesty that made her breath catch, Mara knew that the silence of the house had ended, replaced by a connection that was fragile, new, and full of possibility, the first thread in a story neither of them knew would be so transformative, the first step toward understanding, forgiveness, and a bond that would quietly, steadily, begin to reshape the contours of their shared life. The next few moments in the living room felt heavy with unspoken words, and Mara could sense that Ethan was gathering courage to share something he had held inside for years, his fingers tapping lightly against his knees as if the rhythm would help him find the right words. And when he finally began to speak, his voice was low but steady, carrying the weight of memories he had avoided discussing, memories of the days after his father's death when everything had felt too quiet, too empty, and he had blamed himself for leaving home for college, thinking that by moving away he had abandoned the family at the worst possible time. And Mara listened intently, her heart twisting with each revelation, realizing that the distance she had felt from him was never rejection but a shield he had built to protect both himself and her, a way to cope with grief and guilt that she had misunderstood. And as he spoke, describing the sleepless nights, the constant replaying of conversations he wished he could change, the moments he had wished he could have done more to comfort his father or to support her, Mara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness alone but from the profound relief of finally understanding him, of hearing the truth of his heart laid bare in the safe glow of their shared living room. And she noticed the subtle signs of his struggle, the way his hands fidgeted, the occasional catch in his throat, the way his eyes darted to hers as if seeking forgiveness or at least acceptance. And she realized that what he needed most was not judgment but recognition, acknowledgement that he had survived his own storm, that he had navigated grief in his own way and had arrived at this moment with courage that deserved admiration. And as Ethan's words continued, he confessed that he had watched her from afar during those difficult years, noticing the quiet ways she kept the house together, The small routines she maintained to preserve a sense of normalcy, and that observation had filled him with both admiration and a longing to connect, though he had feared he might intrude on a life that was already so fragile. And Mara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of love, protectiveness, and the bittersweet ache of knowing how much he had suffered alone. And when he finally admitted he did not want to lose family again, that he wanted to rebuild a connection he had once feared was broken forever, Mara's breath caught. And for a moment, the world outside the window, the rain, the dark streets, the quiet neighborhood, faded away, leaving only the two of them, two souls discovering the strength of honesty, forgiveness, and understanding. And as the silence stretched after his confession, broken only by the soft hum of the rain and the distant clap of thunder, Mara reached out instinctively, placing a hand gently over his, a silent promise that she saw him, that she forgave him, and that she too wanted to repair what had been strained by circumstance and time. And in that small gesture, the emotional distance that had hung between them for years began to dissolve, replaced by a fragile yet undeniable bond that shimmered with hope. And as they sat together, hands touching and hearts slowly opening, Mara understood that healing did not always come from grand gestures or dramatic moments, but from truth shared and vulnerability accepted. And that night, as they finally spoke more freely, with laughter breaking through the heaviness and quiet moments of reflection bridging gaps in understanding, Mara realized that their relationship had shifted irreversibly, moving from polite cohabitation to a deeper, more tender connection, one built on honesty, empathy, and the mutual recognition of each other's pain and resilience. And as Ethan finally leaned back, exhausted yet lighter, she felt a surprising mixture of pride and affection, knowing that this conversation, difficult as it had been, was the turning point in their journey, the night when hearts opened enough to allow forgiveness, understanding, and the promise of a future where they could support each other, not as just stepson and stepmother, but as two people bound by love in its quietest, strongest form, a love that could heal old wounds and gently guide them both toward the next chapter of their lives together. The morning after their heartfelt conversation, Mara woke to the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the curtains, and though the world outside was calm, inside her heart, a sense of anticipation and curiosity pulsed strongly because Ethan had asked her to join him for a drive without giving any explanation, only saying it was important and that she would understand soon. And as she followed him into the car, she noticed the quiet nervous energy in his movements, the way he fidgeted with the seatbelt and glanced at her occasionally with a mixture of hope and apprehension. And Mara felt her own pulse quicken, wondering what he could possibly want to show her, sensing that it would not be something ordinary, that somehow, this trip would mark another turning point in their relationship. And as they drove through familiar streets, the rain from the previous night had left everything glistening, the trees dripping with moisture and the sidewalks reflecting the soft light of the morning sun, creating a serene, almost magical atmosphere that made Mara feel as if the world itself was preparing her for what was to come. And when Ethan finally stopped in front of a small, unassuming community center near the river, Mara hesitated, unsure why this place seemed significant, but Ethan's expression urged her to follow, a quiet insistence that made her trust him even as her curiosity heightened. And as they stepped inside, the warmth of the room and the soft smiles of people waiting there greeted them, a mixture of familiar faces and strangers. And Mara realized quickly that this was no casual visit, that Ethan had brought her somewhere meaningful, somewhere he had invested time and effort without her knowing. And as he led her to a small table in the center of the room, he revealed that he had been volunteering here for months, helping restore programs and activities that his father had once loved. Programs dedicated to helping the community and supporting those in need. And Mara felt a wave of admiration mixed with surprise because she had no idea Ethan had carried this sense of responsibility, this quiet determination, while she had assumed he was simply adjusting to life after college. And then he handed her a folder, neatly organized, with documents and plans inside, and as Mara opened it, she realized it was a detailed proposal to reopen a support group for widows and widowers, a group designed to honor his father's memory and to provide hope and companionship for those navigating loss. And Ethan's voice trembled slightly as he explained that he wanted her to lead it, believing in her strength and the kindness she had always shown, even when life had felt unbearable. And Mara's eyes welled up as she absorbed the magnitude of what he was offering, not just a project, but trust, respect, and a way to continue her husband's legacy, and in that moment, she saw Ethan in a new light, not just as a stepson learning to find his way, but as a young man with vision, empathy, and a heart capable of profound thought and care, a heart that had quietly observed her struggles and now invited her into something larger than herself, something that would heal both of them in different ways. And as she looked around the room, seeing the people who had gathered to support the initiative, who had been touched by Ethan's efforts, Mara felt a surge of purpose she hadn't felt in years, a sense that life was offering her a second chance, not through dramatic events or sudden revelations, but through quiet, deliberate action and the courage of someone who cared deeply about family, legacy, and the good they could create together. And as she turned back to Ethan, she noticed the subtle mix of hope and vulnerability in his eyes, a reflection of the risks he had taken in opening his heart, trusting her to understand and to join him in this endeavor. And Mara realized that what he had done was more than thoughtful, it was transformative, because he had created an opportunity for connection, for meaning, and for love expressed in the purest, most selfless form. And as they stood there, the hum of activity around them, the faint smell of coffee and books in the air, the sunlight casting gentle warmth through the windows, Mara felt the weight of years of grief and isolation lift slightly, replaced by the promise of shared purpose, mutual understanding, and a new rhythm to their lives, one where they could support each other, celebrate each other, and rebuild trust and closeness that had been strained by time and circumstance. And even though the path ahead would require effort, patience, and courage, Mara's heart swelled with a quiet joy, realizing that Ethan had not just surprised her with this gesture, he had changed everything, opening doors she hadn't known existed. And in that small community center near the river, with the papers in her hands and the warmth of his gaze upon her, she finally understood the depth of his thoughtfulness, the strength of his character, and the extraordinary capacity for love and care that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen, to be appreciated, and to blossom into something beautiful that would forever alter the course of both their lives. As Mara and Ethan drove home from the community center that afternoon, the city streets bathed in the warm glow of the late sun, Mara felt a quiet thrill in her chest, a feeling that life had shifted subtly yet profoundly, and she couldn't help but notice how different the air felt, lighter somehow, as if the act of sharing, of trusting one another, had lifted a weight they had both carried for years. And Ethan, usually so composed and careful with his emotions, seemed relaxed yet thoughtful, glancing occasionally at Mara with a softness in his eyes that made her heart stir in ways she hadn't expected, a tender warmth that was not romantic in a traditional sense, but deeply intimate in the sense that he had opened a door into his inner world, allowing her to see his hopes, fears, and dreams in a way that made her feel both protective and profoundly connected. And when they arrived home, the familiar house no longer felt empty or silent but alive with possibility, the rooms echoing faintly with the memory of their morning, the sun casting long patterns across the floor that seemed to trace the outlines of the new bond forming between them. And Mara watched Ethan as he set his keys on the table, noticing small details she had never truly seen before, the gentle curve of his smile when he caught her glance, the way he moved with quiet confidence now that the secret he had been carrying was finally shared. And in that moment, she realized that the shock she had felt earlier was not the result of a dramatic confession or sudden event, but something far more meaningful. It was the power of connection, of action born from care, and the realization that love and family could be expressed in ways that were subtle, profound, and life-changing. And as she stepped into the living room, Mara felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude for the young man before her, for his courage, his thoughtfulness, and the trust he had placed in her. And she knew that her own life, which had once felt stagnant and defined by loss, was now being reshaped by these small yet monumental acts of kindness, initiative, and understanding. And she thought of the folder, the proposal, the months of quiet work Ethan had done without her knowing, and she felt her chest tighten with admiration, knowing that he had been creating a bridge for both of them, a bridge that would lead to healing, purpose, and the chance to build something beautiful together, not because it was easy, but because he had chosen to act, to involve her, and to remind her that life still held moments of wonder, surprise, and meaningful connection. And as they prepared for dinner, talking quietly about plans for the community program and what they could do together, Mara noticed how naturally the conversation flowed now, the hesitation and guardedness replaced by laughter, shared ideas, and the subtle teasing that spoke of comfort and familiarity, and she realized that in this simple, domestic rhythm, in the ordinary acts of moving through a day together, their relationship was transforming, growing richer and deeper, threaded with empathy, respect, and a gentle affection that neither of them had anticipated but both welcomed. And when the evening came, Mara stood by the window, looking out at the darkening sky, the first stars beginning to glimmer, and she felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that the connection they had forged was strong enough to endure challenges, soft enough to allow vulnerability, and tender enough to create hope for the future. And as Ethan came to stand beside her, they shared a quiet moment, the silence filled not with emptiness but with understanding, warmth, and the unspoken promise that they would face life together, supporting, inspiring, and learning from one another. And Mara finally understood that healing, love, and family did not always arrive in grand gestures or sudden revelations, but often through consistent, thoughtful actions, mutual trust, and the courage to open one's heart. And as she went to bed that night, her thoughts lingered on the day's events, on Ethan's courage, his thoughtfulness, and the unexpected gift of purpose he had given her, and she fell asleep with a heart lighter than it had been in years, filled with gratitude, hope, and a quiet excitement for the days ahead, knowing that their bond had been irrevocably strengthened, that the house would never feel empty again, and that the love, respect, and connection they shared could quietly transform ordinary life into something extraordinary. And in that peaceful stillness, Mara realized that life's most meaningful surprises often come not from fortune or chance, but from the courage of someone who cares, the willingness to act, and the gentle unfolding of trust and understanding between hearts willing to meet each other. And she drifted into sleep with a sense of wonder and certainty, knowing that this chapter of their lives, shaped by quiet bravery, deep care, and thoughtful love, was only the beginning of a future filled with possibility, connection, and the enduring strength of family forged through honesty, empathy, and the extraordinary power of choosing each other every single day.